The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as Natalie Hayes clocked in at Cedar Creek Medical, the badge scanner beeping her arrival at 6:22 a.m. on a Tuesday nobody would remember. She moved through the med-surg corridor like water finding its level, no rush, no hesitation, just the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power. Her scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable. Her name tag read N. Hayes, RN in plain sans serif font. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, visible only if someone knew to look, said nothing at all. The morning report came at 7. Natalie sat in the back of the conference room while other nurses filed in with coffee cups and tired smiles, their voices already rising in that particular hospital cadence, part gossip, part complaint, part dark humor that kept people sane in spaces where people fell apart. She opened her notebook. Blue ink. No flourishes. She wrote down 3 patients' names, their room numbers, their post-op status, their medication schedules. While others compared weekend stories, Natalie's pen moved across the page with the precision of someone documenting something that mattered. Room 307 was her assignment. Bed A. A retired admiral, cardiac surgery 6 days prior, recovering well but not fast enough to satisfy the cardiologists who kept adjusting his beta blockers and checking his ejection fraction like it was a stock ticker. She didn't know his full chart yet. That was the assignment, learn it slowly, piece by piece, through the kind of questions that sounded like ordinary nurse curiosity instead of Naval Intelligence surveillance. She had been at Cedar Creek for 47 days. By day 60, she would have everything they needed. By day 90, she would have him flagged and transferred to a secure facility before he could pass another encrypted message to the defense contractor sitting 3 states away. She had done this before. Not here. Not in Colorado Springs. But the methodology was the same everywhere: arrive quiet, stay invisible, ask careful questions, document everything, get out clean. 12 years of this. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. And now, a captain in the United States Navy assigned to a civilian hospital in a city where nobody knew her name, watching an admiral she had never met before in her life. Natalie pushed through the double doors to med-surg at 7:31 a.m. and began her rounds. First patient, room 301, a 72-year-old with a colostomy reversal, vital stable, pain controlled. She checked his full line with 2 fingers, felt the slight resistance of the catheter against the vein, looked for any sign of infiltration. The other nurses checked lines the way restaurants checked boxes. Natalie checked them like someone who had once held a man's femoral artery closed with her bare hand while waiting for a helicopter that might never come. Room 303, post-op day 4, hematoma forming above the incision site. She noted the color, deep purple edging toward black, and the warmth radiating from the tissue. She didn't document it yet. Documenting meant involving Dr. Mercer, and Dr. Mercer was the reason she was here, though not the Admiral. Not directly. The Admiral was the assignment. Dr. Mercer was the mystery that lay underneath, the reason Naval Intelligence had asked her to stay longer than 47 days, to keep watching, to keep noting the inconsistencies between the equipment orders and the actual supplies in the locked cabinets. She arrived at room 307 at 7:58 a.m. The Admiral lay in the hospital bed with the posture of a man who had learned never to show pain. 76 years old. Surgical scar running down his sternum like a red lightning bolt. His eyes were the color of the Atlantic in November. They opened as she approached, tracking her movements with the same attention she had learned to recognize in people who had also survived things that were supposed to be unsurvivable. "Morning, Admiral Krane," she said, her voice level and professional. "I'm going to check your incision." He nodded. She peeled back the gauze with gloved hands, examined the line of staples, looked for any sign of infection or dehiscence. The surgical site was clean. Healing as expected. She had performed thoracotomies in conditions infinitely worse than this, in darkness, in the smell of diesel and copper blood, in spaces where the only light came from muzzle flashes and the occasional flare dropping from the sky like dying stars. She replaced the gauze and stepped back. He was still watching her. "You ever work in field medicine?" His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that came from giving orders in combat situations, where volume meant weakness and stillness meant authority. "No, sir," she said. "Just civilian nursing." She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. The trembling wasn't fear. It was recognition. It was the first crack in a cover that had held solid for 47 days. But her hands didn't shake as she disposed of the old gauze and documented the assessment in his chart. Her voice stayed level as she checked his medications against the 4 pump and confirmed the doses matched his orders. She was a nurse. Just a nurse. Nothing more. She was out of the room in 4 minutes. The supply closet on the 2nd floor was where she started documenting. It wasn't her assigned task. That privilege belonged to the daytime supply coordinator, a woman named Patricia who had worked at Cedar Creek for 11 years and had stopped asking questions in year 3. But Natalie asked questions. She asked them quietly, in the margins of her work, in the gaps between her visible responsibilities. She opened the locked cabinet where the cardiac equipment was stored and compared the physical inventory against the computerized order logs from the past 90 days. The first discrepancy, 47 units of hemodynamic monitoring equipment ordered. 23 units in stock. But the purchase orders showed invoices for all 47. And the patient charts, she had photographed them with a pen camera during her charting time, showed only 12 patients requiring that level of monitoring in the past month. The pen camera was small enough to hide in her palm. She photographed the supply logs, photographed the orders, photographed the invoices. She moved slowly, deliberately, with a kind of methodical precision that made her look like she was simply doing inventory instead of documenting what appeared to be wholesale billing fraud. 7 patients on this floor in the past month. 8 units of cardiac monitoring equipment per patient average. But the orders showed nearly 50 units purchased and billed to insurance companies that had no patients requiring that equipment. She was photographing the equipment order from 3 weeks prior when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She closed the cabinet with her hip and turned, her face neutral. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway of the supply closet, his white coat pristine, his hands in his pockets, his expression arranged in something that approximated curiosity but contained something else entirely underneath. She had seen that expression before, in men who believed they owned the space they occupied, in men who never expected anyone to ask questions about their authority. "Inventory?" he asked. "Checking stock levels," Natalie said. Her voice was soft, deferential. Just a nurse following protocol. Some of the numbers seemed off. He stepped into the closet. He was taller than her by 8 inches, broad through the shoulders, the kind of surgeon who had learned that physical size combined with institutional authority created a gravity well that most people couldn't escape. His cologne was expensive, something with cedar and leather, the kind of fragrance that announced money the way his watch announced wealth. A Patek Philippe. $40,000 minimum. She had photographed it once, along with the quarterly bonus stubs in his hospital office, the real estate portfolio, the shell company registered in Delaware that received payments from 3 different medical supply vendors. "The numbers are exactly right," he said. His voice was pleasant. The kind of pleasant that came from having never been challenged and not being prepared for the possibility. "We've had high demand for cardiac monitoring equipment. Several complex cases. I only see 7 patients," she said. Her pen was back in her pocket now. The photos were backed up to 3 separate servers, each one requiring a military-grade encryption key. 7 patients, 47 units billed. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that a person he had dismissed as part of the background had eyes and the ability to use them. He stepped closer. She didn't step back. "New nurses sometimes misunderstand hospital billing procedures," he said. "It's complicated. Insurance, contracts, vendor relationships. Things you're not qualified to understand." "Probably," she said. Her hands were loose at her sides. Calm. Everything about her was calm in the way that apex predators were calm, not peaceful, but centered, balanced, ready to move in any direction at full speed. "I apologize for the confusion." She was gone before he could respond, moving past him with the kind of quiet efficiency that made people question whether she had actually been there at all. She had learned early in her military career that most people saw what they expected to see, and they expected to see a nurse who knew her place. A woman who didn't ask uncomfortable questions. A woman who would forget about discrepancies and supply numbers and billion-dollar contracts made between surgeons and pharmaceutical representatives. Dr. Mercer watched her go. His hand was still in his pocket. He was thinking something. Calculating something. She knew the look. It was the same look men had given her in interrogation rooms and in dark hallways and across coffee tables where deals were being made. It was the look of someone reassessing whether a person they had underestimated might actually pose a problem. The rest of her shift passed in the steady rhythm of vital signs and medication checks. She documented everything. She stayed late by 47 minutes, well into the evening when the hospital lights dimmed to their secondary level and the hallways became long corridors of silence punctuated by ventilators and the occasional page from the overhead speaker. She verified supply inventories. She triple-checked medication dosages. She moved through the hospital like someone who had no reason to exist in anyone's memory, which was exactly the point. When she clocked out at 8:13 p.m., Dr. Mercer was standing at the nursing station, his phone in his hand, his expression neutral. But his eyes tracked her exit. She felt the weight of his attention like a scope on her back, and she knew with absolute certainty that in trying to document his fraud, she had just made herself visible to the one person at Cedar Creek Medical who needed to remain ignorant of her presence. It wasn't a request. It was a certainty. Everything was about to change. Room for 12 smelled like antiseptic and fear. The Rodriguez family filled every corner, elderly parents in the visitor chairs, 2 adult children standing, a teenager perched on the windowsill with her phone already recording. Natalie had been explaining the medication schedule for 17 minutes, walking them through the cardiac protocol, the timing, the why behind every choice. Mrs. Rodriguez was nodding. Her husband was asking intelligent questions. The teenager's phone was capturing everything, which meant Cedar Creek's liability team would see this interaction, and that mattered because thorough documentation protected patients. The door slammed open. Dr. Mercer filled the frame like a predator recognizing weakness in the herd. His white coat was pristine. His expression was sculpted rage. He crossed the room in 4 strides and snatched the chart from Natalie's hands, not asking, not requesting, commanding the space through sheer institutional gravity. His voice came out loud enough for the hallway to hear. This is exactly the sloppy, incompetent documentation I've been discussing with administration. He didn't look at Natalie. He turned to the family, and his face arranged itself into concerned authority. I sincerely apologize you've been assigned our most careless nurse. Miss Hayes seems to believe hospital protocols are optional suggestions. Perhaps guidelines don't apply in whatever training program she completed. The daughter started to speak. Mercer raised one hand. Sir, you're not medically trained. You wouldn't recognize negligence if it was killing your mother. Mr. Rodriguez stood up. Actually, she's been incredibly thorough. She explained everything clearly, Anne. Thank you for your input. I'll handle the medical decisions. Mercer circled 3 entries in red pen with sharp, violent strokes. Amateur hour. This. And this. Fundamentally unsafe charting practices that put your mother at risk. He was marking Natalie's corrections to his own inflated billing codes. The phantom charges she'd documented. The discrepancies she'd flagged. He was weaponizing her accuracy as incompetence, inverting evidence into accusation through sheer confidence. Perhaps if you spent less time playing detective with supply orders, clipboard Columbo, investigating things that aren't your concern, and more time learning basic nursing fundamentals, we wouldn't have these problems. Natalie's hands remained steady on her tablet. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, the way soldiers rehearse ambushes. The jaw clench came anyway, involuntary, a half-second tightening of the muscles at her temples. But her voice stayed flat, measured, exactly level. I'll resubmit according to your specifications, Dr. Mercer. Nothing in her tone suggested defiance. Nothing suggested agreement. She sounded like someone reading a statement into a recording device, all effect removed, all personality erased. The teenager's phone captured that too, the complete absence of emotion, the mechanical compliance that somehow made Mercer look smaller for needing it. He left without another word. But the damage was atmospheric. The Rodriguez's trust had shifted. Mrs. Rodriguez's confidence in her care had a hairline fracture now, visible only to someone trained to see it. That was Mercer's genius. Not loud cruelty. Strategic cruelty. The kind that looked like professional concern. The formal write-up appeared on the unit board the next morning at 6:51 a.m., before shift change, when everyone would see it. Natalie found it during her pre-shift check of the break room bulletin board, positioned directly above the scheduling matrix so nobody could miss it. The letterhead read Cedar Creek Medical, Department of Professional Standards. Dr. James Mercer's signature sprawled across the bottom in aggressive cursive. Incident report, insubordination and professional conduct. Employee, Natalie Hayes, RN. Date, yesterday. Documented observation, employee questioned attending physician judgment regarding clinical supply orders, demonstrating insubordination and lack of respect for chain of command. Employee submitted charting with unexplained discrepancies regarding medication administration timelines. During evening rounds, employee's documentation was found to contain multiple errors requiring physician correction. Recommendation, final written warning before termination review. She read it 3 times. The document was technically accurate, she had questioned the supply orders, she had submitted charting with discrepancies, accurate counts where his numbers were false, she had documented medication timelines precisely, which made his phantom procedures visible. He'd weaponized truth by removing context. Her jaw clenched again. Just that. No tremor in her hands. No flush in her cheeks. She read the document while standing in a break room filled with 7 other nurses, and her facial expression never shifted. That was what they saw, a woman reading criticism with the emotional response of someone reading a cereal box. She took a photo on her phone. Evidence. The Navy would want photographs of the escalation timeline. Then she returned to charting. But that wasn't the worst part. Lunch arrived at 12:15. The break room was crowded, for nurses at the table, the microwave humming, someone sandwich defrosting under the fluorescent lights that buzzed their endless, mechanical song. Natalie entered with her container of rice and grilled chicken, and the room's atmospheric pressure changed immediately. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone knocked over a coffee cup, and the scramble for paper towels became urgent, became an excuse to move. Within 30 seconds, all 4 nurses had gathered their things and left. The last one, Jennifer from Nights, whispered something as she passed. Not to Natalie. To the empty air. Not worth getting on his bad side. The room was hers alone. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant complaint. The microwave fan spun. Outside, Colorado Springs weather moved across the city, cool October wind that smelled like rain coming, like pressure systems shifting. Natalie sat at the table where she'd sat every lunch for 6 weeks and ate her chicken and rice without tasting it, because this was the campaign. Not the shouting. The silence. The social exile that made you invisible while simultaneously making you visible as someone to avoid. Her phone was on the table. No messages. No one texted. That was protocol in a social exile. Acknowledge her and you caught the same treatment. She finished eating in 11 minutes and returned to the floor. Dr. Mercer had reassigned her shifts with surgical precision. Overnight rotations. Weekends. The worst staffing ratios. Minimal backup. She'd worked Thursday night with 1 resident and a tech for 40 beds, which meant she'd spent the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. triaging medication requests by acuity level, deciding what could wait and what couldn't, functioning essentially as a 1-person rapid response system. She'd done it without complaint because complaining would validate Mercer's narrative that she was overwhelmed, incompetent, desperate. Friday night brought something different. As she clocked in at 23:15, the night charge nurse handed her the census report. Room 307. Room 310. And room 315, which had been empty yesterday. Room 315 was now occupied. Admiral Douglas Krane, post-op day from cardiac surgery, transferred from the ICU due to stable progression and improved cardiac function, which was code for the Admiral had demanded privacy and the ICU director had allowed it because Navy carries weight that hospital administration understood at a cellular level. It wasn't coincidence. Mercer had done this deliberately. The one patient Natalie needed to monitor was now on her shift, now in her care, now completely visible. If she failed at monitoring Krane, if she missed any detail in his recovery, Mercer would use it. If she succeeded, if she proved herself medically competent, Mercer would claim credit for her work. Either way, he'd moved her closest asset into the light. It was strategic. Natalie had to respect the move even as she calculated how to counter it. His wound check came at 3:16 a.m., when the hallway was empty except for the cleaning crew working the far end. Admiral Krane was awake, actually awake, not the medicated half-consciousness of post-op patients who'd been on fentanyl for 4 days. His eyes tracked her as she approached, sharp and assessing, the look of a man used to reading intentions in split seconds. Natalie changed his dressing with deliberate precision. She used a 4-finger compression technique to check for fluid accumulation around the incision site, pressing gently in a square pattern, feeling for spongy swelling that would indicate infection. His sternum was healing. The surgical line was clean. No drainage, no erythema, no signs of rejection. Her hands moved the way they'd moved in Baghdad, the way they'd moved in a dozen field stations where antibiotics were theoretical and infection was death. The memory lived in her muscle memory, in the specific pressure of fingertips, the angle of approach, the way you could read tissue the way a sailor reads currents. The Admiral watched her the entire time. When she started to step back, his voice came out quiet. Educational. Like he was testing something. Baghdad, 2007, you're the medic who did the 4-vessel bypass in that bombed-out clinic with nothing but field instruments, aren't you? Natalie's hands froze. 1 full second of stillness. Then she continued moving, completed the dressing change, checked his monitor readings, responded in a voice that didn't carry. You're mistaken, Admiral. I've never been to Baghdad. But her eyes flicked to the doorway. Checking for witnesses. Checking for cameras. Her jaw had gone tight in a way that telegraphed everything to someone trained to see it, the flash of recognition, the calculation of exposure, the brief terror that 6 weeks of careful invisibility had been erased by 2 words. The Admiral smiled. Not unkindly. But with the certainty of someone who'd just confirmed something he already knew. Get some rest, Captain. He'd used her rank. Not her name. Not that Miss Hayes that Mercer used like a weapon. He'd used her title in a voice that meant he knew exactly what she was, exactly what she'd done, exactly why she was here. Natalie finished her charting and clocked out at 7:15 a.m. with Admiral Krane's file sitting in the secure upload queue on her encrypted phone, ready for transmission. The mission was operational. The Admiral was conscious and stable. Dr. Mercer was still operating fraud, still vulnerable, still documented. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. She didn't know that Tuesday would change everything. The intercom crackled at 4:24 p.m. A man in a maintenance uniform, grey shirt stained with something darker than sweat, whispered into a radio that didn't belong to him, bomb in the building. 3rd floor. North wing. Then he pulled the fire alarm. The sound was like a physical thing, a shriek that turned the hallways inside out. Patients screaming. Families scrambling toward exits. Doctors shouting contradictory orders that nobody followed because nobody could hear anything over the alarm's mechanical wail. The smell of panic is real. It smells like sweat and antiseptic, and the moment someone realizes the world has stopped being predictable. Natalie was charting on the med-surg floor when it happened. She didn't freeze. She didn't run. She set down her pen, closed the chart, and moved. The emergency protocol she designed during her first week was muscle memory now, triage by mobility, not acuity. The ones who could walk funneled toward the south stairwell. The ones who needed wheelchairs went to designated assembly point on the second floor, safer than moving them 3 flights down in evacuation chaos. The ones on ventilators, the ones with fresh surgical sites, the ones whose lives depended on steady hand stayed with her until she could move them systematically. She was in room for 12 when the cascade started. Mrs. Chen, 73, post-op hip replacement, could walk with a walker. Mrs. Chen, we're evacuating. You're going to use the south stairwell. Red line on the floor will guide you. Walk at your own pace. Don't run. Don't stop for anything. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the alarm scream like a blade through silk. Mrs. Chen nodded and moved. That was the difference between panic and purpose. Natalie gave them purpose. Room for 14, Mr. Kowalski, diabetic foot ulcer repair, wheelchair dependent. With me. We're going to the second floor assembly point. I'm pushing you. Hold the armrests. She moved his for stand in one hand, pushed the chair with the other, navigated him through corridors already congested with slower-moving staff carrying clipboards and looking lost. The fluorescent light seemed to pulse with the alarm, turning everything strobe bright and shadow dark in sequence. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Mercer was supposed to be orchestrating his own floor's evacuation. Instead, at 4:51 p.m., he was sprinting toward the parking lot. No stretcher. No protocol. No backward glance at the 63 patients in his care. He positioned himself near the stairwell door 15 seconds before the alarm, already moving toward his BMW, already calculating which insurance companies he could call from a highway hotel to cover his tracks. The fraud was documented now. Natalie's questions were getting closer. The emergency was convenient. People were evacuating. He disappeared into the chaos like it was a door. Natalie noticed. She always noticed. She filed it away. By 4:53 p.m., she'd moved 17 patients from the med-surg floor to secondary assembly points. The evacuation was proceeding with the kind of efficiency that only happens when one person is actually thinking while everyone else is reacting. She'd cleared the hallway systematically, checked rooms with closed doors, and verified that no patient was left behind confused or panicked. The stairs smelled like fear and coffee and rain. Someone had left a window open somewhere and the weather was rolling in. But the north stairwell was still congested. Nurses she'd worked with for months, nurses who'd avoided her lunch table, were standing on the landing between the third and fourth floors, frozen. A patient, one of Mercer's, she noted, was refusing to move down. Elderly man, scared, convinced the bomb was on the lower floors. It said third floor, he was saying. The bomb's on the third floor. That means it's above us. We should go up. We should. Down, Natalie said. Just one word. She'd moved to the stairwell without anyone noticing. Third floor is above you. We're going down. Now. Let's move. Something in her voice made him move. Something that didn't sound like a nurse asking. He didn't understand what he was hearing, but his body understood and obeyed. She shepherded him down 3 flights, handed him off to security, and turned back up. The building was emptying. That was good. The chaos was beginning to organize itself. That was also good. Organized chaos was the only kind she could work with, and she could work with any kind. Her heart rate hadn't changed. Her hands were perfectly steady. The part of her brain that had learned tactical movement in the corridors of Baghdad recognized this for what it was, a building clearing operation. Single file. Check corners. Verify routes. Leave no one behind. The principle was identical whether you were moving civilians out of a war zone or patients out of a hospital. The stairwell echo was different on the third floor landing. Louder. Emptier. She could hear footsteps above and below, but the landing itself was vacant. The fire suppression system had begun its work, water misting from the sprinkler heads, cold rain that had nothing to do with weather, making the concrete slick and treacherous. The smell of petrichor mixed with hospital bleach created something that smelled like burned metal. She was checking the corridor when she saw him. Admiral Krane was supposed to be in ICU recovery, confined to bed, restricted to supervised mobility. Instead, he was dragging himself up the north stairwell, his hospital gown soaked through with blood, his four-pole abandoned 3 flights below. He was moving like a man who'd made a decision his body couldn't execute. His chest was heaving. His lips were already starting to turn blue. "Admiral," she said. It wasn't a question. He turned his head, saw her, and something crossed his face that looked like relief. "Trying to reach the 3rd floor. Thought I could disarm it. Thought I," his breath came in gasps. Each one cost him something. His fresh surgical site was hemorrhaging. She could see the blood blooming through the gauze, see the way his incision was tearing from the stress and exertion, see the moment his body decided it was done. His pulse disappeared before he hit the floor. She was already moving. Not running. Moving. The difference was intention. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. A first-year resident named Dr. Patel was behind her, the crash cart he'd been pushing frozen mid-stride, his phone already out, his voice high and fractured. Code blue, North Stairwell Landing 3, we need." "He won't survive transport," Natalie said. The alarm was still screaming. The building was still emptying. The Admiral was already losing consciousness. Time wasn't a thing that existed anymore. Time was just a ticking clock counting down. She ripped open the crash cart with one motion that looked casual but was anything but. Betadine. Sterile field. She poured the disinfectant across his chest like she was painting a masterpiece, and maybe she was. The scalpel was in her hand before she'd consciously decided to reach for it. "You're going to assist me?" "Exactly what I tell you. Exactly when I tell you. Or he dies." "We can't do a thoracotomy in a stairwell," Patel said. His voice was cracking. "We don't have supplies, we don't have." The incision opened the Admiral's chest in one motion. Just one. The muscle memory from Baghdad took over completely. The hands that had held 3 tours worth of dying soldiers steady moved like they'd never stopped. Like the 10 years since she'd left field medicine was nothing. Like her body had been waiting for exactly this moment since the day she'd put on a civilian nurse's badge. Blood pooled on the concrete landing. Patel made a sound like a wounded animal. "Cross-clamp," Natalie said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a command that had survived a decade of waiting. "Between my fingers. Now." Patel moved. Something in her tone had activated the part of his training that understood this was someone who knew what they were doing. His hands shook, but they moved. Natalie's bare hand was inside the Admiral's chest cavity, her fingers finding the hemorrhaging vessel, compressing his aorta with the kind of precision that only comes from having done it in worse conditions. Sandstorm conditions. Mortar round conditions. The kind of stairwell where your patient might be your commanding officer and the next round might have your name on it. 40 silk suture. "I'm going to walk you through clamping." I can't. "You can. You will. Listen." The stairwell had become an operating theater. The alarm was the heartbeat monitor. The chaos of evacuation was just background noise. She talked Patel through every step with the kind of calm that only happens when you've already seen the worst the world has to offer. When nothing surprises you anymore because surprise is a luxury only people living normal lives can afford. Her voice never rose. Never shook. Never betrayed anything except absolute certainty. "There. Feel that? That's the bleeder. Steady pressure. Steady. That's it." The Admiral's heart restarted under her compression. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. For minutes of her hands inside his chest and his hand responding to her will like she was operating a machine instead of saving a life. The code team arrived at 5:03 p.m. They came up the stairwell and stopped cold. The scene they found was impossible. A nurse covered in blood. A resident with his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold a clamp. An admiral with his chest cavity open in the middle of a stairwell evacuation. The paramedic captain, a man with 15 years of emergency response experience, stood frozen for exactly 1 second. Then, "Who the hell are you?" Natalie didn't answer. She just kept her hand steady and talked Patel through the next step. The one after that. The paramedic captain watched for 2 seconds more, recognized field surgical technique that shouldn't exist outside a military operation, and made his calls. Gurney. ICU. Surgical team standing by. They moved the Admiral with the kind of speed that only comes when you know you're watching something you don't understand but recognize as necessity. The security camera on the stairwell landing captured everything. Natalie Hayes standing over Admiral Douglas Krane with a bloody scalpel in her hand. Her scrub soaked red. Her expression perfectly calm. Her hand steady as a surgical laser. One frame showed her fingers inside his chest cavity. Another showed her voice, mouth open, clearly giving commands that the resident was following like she was the only person in the building who knew how to keep someone alive. The footage would reach Dr. Mercer by 6:15 p.m., forwarded by a hospital administrator who didn't understand what he was looking at but knew something had gone wrong. A nurse with a scalpel. A Navy admiral on her operating table. Blood everywhere. By 7:33 p.m., Dr. Mercer had made his first call. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that the Admiral was alive. What mattered was that Natalie was already stepping back, already letting the professionals take over, already becoming invisible again. She walked down the stairwell alone. Peeled off her contaminated scrubs in the decontamination station. Showered the blood away under water that ran red and then clear. Changed into fresh scrubs that felt like a costume. By the time she clocked out at 7:51 p.m., Cedar Creek Medical was locked down and chaotic. The bomb threat had turned out to be a hoax, a maintenance worker's sick joke that nobody found funny anymore. The building was being swept. The evacuation had been textbook. 63 patients accounted for. 0 casualties. 1 admiral in the ICU with injuries that should have been fatal and 1 nurse going home to an empty apartment like she'd done nothing at all. She didn't know that the security footage was already being reviewed. She didn't know that her composure during a stairwell thoracotomy was about to be the only thing standing between her and the hospital's lawyers. She didn't know that Dr. Mercer was making phone calls to board members and outside investigators and character assassins who specialized in turning heroes into villains if you paid them enough. She only knew that the rain was beginning to fall outside, and somewhere in an ICU recovery room, a Navy admiral was breathing because she'd remembered Baghdad. Because she'd moved when everyone else froze. Because the hands that had learned to hold lives together in a war never forgot how. The quiet ones always know the most dangerous things. The north stairwell smelled like copper and rain. Natalie's boots echoed down the concrete steps, 1 floor, 2 floors, her eyes tracking the evacuation path she'd memorized during her first shift. The bomb threat had cleared the building in 7 minutes, faster than regulation, because she'd moved faster than regulation, and now she was retracing steps, counting rooms, verifying the 3rd floor was actually empty. That's when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. A silence. The specific absence of a heartbeat monitor's rhythm, the kind of quiet that meant something had stopped working. She turned. Found him in the stairwell landing between floors 3 and 2, Admiral Douglas Krane collapsed against the wall, his hospital gown soaked burgundy where his fresh surgical incision had split open under stress. His chest heaved. His eyes rolled back. His body convulsed once, hard enough to crack his head against the concrete. No pulse. No breath. Code blue on a stairwell landing, surrounded by cinderblock and fluorescent emergency lighting and absolutely nothing that would save his life if she didn't move in the next 90 seconds. Natalie didn't reach for her phone. Didn't shout for help that wouldn't arrive in time. Her hands moved the way they'd been trained to move in a bombed-out clinic in Baghdad with nothing but field instruments and a prayer, and muscle memory didn't ask for permission, it just took over. She was down beside him, 2 fingers on his neck confirming what she already knew, flatline. His incision gaped open, and she could see the surgical site was hemorrhaging internally. The stress of evacuation, the trauma to his fresh repair, the blood pooling in his thoracic cavity was crushing his heart like a fist. She needed a scalpel. She needed it now. The crash cart was 45 seconds away. The nearest actual surgical suite was 2 floors up, past a stairwell door, around 2 corridors. Natalie made the calculation a combat medic makes: some patients are alive if you move. Some patients are dead if you wait. She ran. 20 seconds to the crash cart on the main floor landing. Her fingers found the surgical kit, the metal instruments cool against her palms, and she grabbed a number for surgical blade, sterile, sharp enough to part skin like water. She was back at the landing in 38 seconds total, her hands already moving as her knees hit the tile beside him. "Stay with me, Admiral," she whispered, and then she cracked his chest. The first incision followed his ribcage like she'd done it 1,000 times, because she had. Left anterolateral thoracotomy, the blade sliding through tissue, through muscle, the hiss of air escaping from a body in collapse. Blood. More blood than there should be, but that's what happens when you wait, the body bleeds out trying to save itself. She reached in, felt the familiar resistance of ribs, the geometry of a human being she was about to rewire. A resident appeared in the stairwell, some young doctor who'd been evacuating patients, and he saw what she was doing and his face went the color of old bone. "Get me a cross clamp," Natalie said. Her voice was level. Steady. The voice of someone who'd done this before under mortar fire with shrapnel still falling. From the cart. The satin sky clamp. "Move." He didn't move. He was staring at her hand inside the Admiral's chest. "Now, Doctor." The word came out like a command from a parade ground. The resident flinched, then ran. Natalie's other hand found Crane's aorta. She could feel it even in the blood and tissue, that thick vessel like a hose under pressure, and she compressed it with her fingers, applying direct pressure to stop the bleeding at the source. Her jaw clenched. Her breathing stayed level. Her free hand worked to clear the surgical field, to see what was actually broken, to calculate if he could survive the next 4 minutes. The resident came back with the clamp, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it on her. "Listen to me," Natalie said, and her eyes met his, and something in that gaze, something that carried the weight of a field hospital and 3 tours and 8 faces from a unit photo, 3 of them gone now, steadied him. "I'm going to maintain pressure on his aorta. You're going to position that clamp exactly where I tell you. Not close. Not approximately. Exactly. Can you do that?" He nodded. The trembling didn't stop, but his hands obeyed. "The vessel is anterolateral. You see it? The thick one. I'm going to lift slightly to show you the angle." She moved her fingers a millimeter, enough for him to see the anatomy. "Cross-clamp that position. 3 seconds. That's all the time I'm giving you." His hands moved. Shook. Almost dropped the clamp twice. But he positioned it, and Natalie guided his fingers, and when the clamp went on, the bleeding stopped. The pressure under her other hand released. She felt the vessel hold instead of bleeding out, and she released her breath in a single controlled exhale. "Good," she said. The word came out soft. "Stay with that clamp. Don't move it. You're keeping him alive. You understand? You move that clamp, his aorta bleeds out and he dies on this stairwell. So you stay right here and you don't let anything distract you." The resident nodded, his eyes locked on his hands, his whole body focused on holding a 3-inch piece of metal in exactly the right position. Natalie worked. Her hands found the puncture site in the aorta, the place where the surgeon's repair had failed under sudden pressure and stress. She could feel it, even with the clamp holding, a small tear in the vessel wall. Fixable. Barely. With steady hands and clear eyes, and someone who'd done this enough times that her fingers knew the geometry of a human heart better than a surgeon knew his own heartbeat. She didn't have a proper repair kit. She had a scalpel, a clamp, and muscle memory. So she worked with what she had. Worked the way she'd worked in a clinic that had lost its roof to a missile strike, with only field instruments and the knowledge that a human being would live or die based on whether her hand stayed steady. Time didn't exist anymore. There was only the procedure. Only the Admiral's chest open beneath her hands, only the resident holding the clamp, only the surgical work that had to be perfect because perfect was the only margin between alive and dead. By the time paramedics came down the stairwell, someone had finally called them, some nurse who'd realized what was happening. Natalie had already stabilized the tear. The bleeding had stopped. Crane's color, while still pale, had shifted from ash to something almost human. "Get him to ICU," she said, and it wasn't a request. She was already stepping back, letting the paramedics in with their equipment and their protocols, but her eye stayed on the Admiral's face, watching for the moment his consciousness returned. Watching to see if her hands had been fast enough. They were. His eyelids flickered. His breathing deepened. The heart monitor, once they got him on equipment, showed a rhythm, irregular, but present. Present meant alive. Security arrived while the paramedics were transporting him upstairs. 2 guards in Cedar Creek Medical uniforms, and behind them, a shift supervisor Natalie didn't recognize. The officer's eyes moved from the bloody stairwell landing to Natalie's hands, which were still red, to the scalpel she'd set carefully on the crash cart. "We need a statement," the officer said. His voice was calm, procedural. He'd already seen the security footage from the hallway camera. He already knew what she'd done. Natalie nodded. She didn't look at her hands. Didn't clean them. Just stood there in the stairwell landing, surrounded by blood and the equipment of emergency medicine, and answered their questions with the precision of someone accustomed to giving operational debriefs. "How many minutes without circulation?" 5, maybe 6. "What exactly did you do?" "Emergency thoracotomy, aortic compression, cross-clamp repair." "Where did you learn that procedure?" "Field medicine training, military background, standard combat first responder certification." The answers were technically true and technically useless because they explained the how without explaining the why, and the why was locked behind 3 months of operational security that she couldn't breach without burning the entire investigation into Dr. Mercer's billing fraud. The security officer's pen moved across his clipboard. Behind him, another guard was photographing the stairwell landing. The camera flash caught the scalpel, caught Natalie's blood-stained hands, caught the moment when everything started to change and neither of them yet understood it. "The paramedic said you saved his life," the officer said finally. His tone suggested this complicated things. Saved him, but maybe did it in a way that's going to raise questions about scope of practice. Natalie knew. She'd known the moment she'd made the first incision. A nurse performing thoracotomy is not a nurse anymore, she's a surgeon, and surgeons are credentialed and licensed in ways that nurses aren't. The moment she cracked that chest to save the Admiral's life, she'd stepped outside the legal boundaries of what her current position allowed her to do. She'd violated protocol. She'd exceeded her scope. She'd saved a life, and in doing so, she'd made herself visible. The security officer was still watching her, waiting for some kind of response or explanation or maybe a tremor in her hands. Natalie's jaw was tight enough to ache, a muscle jumping in her cheek, but her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about training your body to work under fire. It learned to work under any kind of pressure, any kind of scrutiny, any kind of moment where being calm meant staying alive. "Thank you for documenting the incident," she said. Her voice was level. Controlled. The voice of a nurse who'd done what she had to do and accepted the consequences without drama. "I'm available if you need additional information." The officer didn't respond immediately. Something in her composure seemed to unsettle him more than the blood did. But he just nodded, made a final note, and told her to report any injuries to occupational health before she left for the day. She didn't leave. She went back to work. Because that's what people do when they're pretending to be ordinary. When they're living under a cover story. When they have 3 months of investigation still running and an admiral in the ICU whose life depends on no one asking too many questions yet. She clocked back into the system, moved through the aftermath of the evacuation, filled out incident reports with the same precision she'd used to save a life. What happened next didn't just change the next 12 hours. It ended careers. Within 6 hours, Dr. Mercer had made 7 phone calls. Not 6, 7. Each one placed from his office with the door locked, his voice steady as a scalpel, cutting with surgical precision through the ears of board members who owed him favors. Cedar Creek's chief of surgery had saved their reputations at a steakhouse in Cherry Creek, had written letters of recommendation for their children, had arranged consulting gigs that padded their retirement accounts. Now he was calling in every debt. That nurse performed an unauthorized emergency procedure on a federal patient without surgical authorization, he told the board chairman. She cracked an admiral's chest in a stairwell with field instruments. That's not heroism, that's recklessness. That's liability exposure. That's potentially manslaughter. His voice didn't waver. The security footage shows her standing over him with a bloody scalpel. She has no record of formal emergency surgical training. No credentials to be doing what she did. She violated every protocol in our system. The board chairman took notes. By 8 a.m., he'd forwarded those notes to 4 other members. By 9 a.m., the hospital administrator had received a call from outside investigators, the kind that come with federal case numbers and requests for immediate credential verification. Someone had contacted the state nursing board. Someone had flagged Natalie's employment history. Someone was asking questions about her background, her references, her previous positions that didn't quite add up because half of them were classified, because the military doesn't publish names of personnel working intelligence operations, because her cover had been constructed with the precision of a surgical incision and was now being systematically dissected by people who had no idea what they were actually looking at. The calls came in waves. A hospital in Sacramento reported that a reference checker had insinuated Natalie had stolen medication from their controlled substance cabinet, a claim that never happened, a lie constructed from whole cloth, planted into the system like shrapnel. Her credentials were scrutinized. Her certifications were questioned. Someone somewhere was building a case against her, one innuendo at a time, one phone call at a time, and Natalie could not defend herself because the truth was classified, because saying the words Naval Intelligence operation would blow the entire Krane investigation open, would compromise 14 months of work, would end a mission that was supposed to run another 6 weeks. The termination notice arrived at 11:44 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was printed on hospital letterhead, signed by the Chief of Human Resources, and cited unauthorized medical procedure, violation of surgical protocols, and gross insubordination. It was effective immediately. Security would escort her from the building. She was to surrender her badge and access credentials. She was instructed not to contact any hospital staff. She was instructed not to discuss the circumstances of her termination without legal counsel. Natalie read the letter twice. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't shake. She folded the paper into thirds and placed it on her kitchen table beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago. The letter sat there like an artifact, proof that the world had just shifted, that the calculated risks she'd taken for 3 months had just become real, that the bomb threat in the stairwell had been the beginning of the end, not the moment of salvation everyone else assumed it was. She couldn't fight this. She couldn't call a lawyer and explain that she was actually working for the Office of Naval Intelligence. She couldn't contact Admiral Krane and ask him to come forward because that would destroy the investigation into the defense contractor he was supposed to be luring into the open. She couldn't tell anyone that the woman they'd just fired was the one person in that hospital who actually knew what the hell she was doing, because the moment the truth came out, the cover was burned, the operation was dead, and 3 months of sacrifice meant nothing. That evening, the rain came like judgment. It hammered the bus shelter in sheets, soaking through her scrubs. She'd changed out of her hospital clothes at a Target bathroom, left them in a trash can, put on the same blue uniform she'd worn yesterday because she had nothing else packed. The rain came sideways, driven by wind that felt personal, vindictive, like the world was making a point. She stood at the bus stop on Bijou Street with a cardboard box balanced against her hip. Inside it, everything that mattered from her civilian life fit in a space smaller than a desktop. A cracked coffee mug from a Target clearance bin, $2, chipped handle, but she liked the weight of it. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, gasping in the humidity, its leaves turning translucent. And a photograph. 8 faces. Her team from Fallujah, 2007. Taken on the morning before the clinic bombing, before everything changed. Second Lieutenant Marcus Rivera with his 1,000-watt smile. Corporal James Chen with his rifle propped against his shoulder. Staff Sergeant David Okafor, the one who'd held her steady when she couldn't hold herself. 3 of them were dead now. 3 of them were in Arlington Cemetery with flags that snapped in the wind and stones that got covered in snow every winter. The others had scattered: a ranch in Montana, a job at a tech company in Seattle, a business degree and a law practice in D.C. Only Natalie had stayed still. Only Natalie had kept moving forward while standing in place. The bus pulled up. The doors wheezed open. She stepped inside and found a seat in the back, the cardboard box damp against her legs, the photograph inside starting to warp from the moisture. She could have called someone. She could have contacted her handler, given the word that the operation was blown, requested extraction. Instead, she sat in the back of a bus in Colorado Springs and watched the rain streak the windows and said nothing at all, because sometimes silence is the only dignity left. At 2 a.m., her son Marcus was still awake in their small 2-bedroom house on the northeast side of town. He'd heard her come home, the sound of wet clothes dropping into the hamper, the sound of water running in the shower, the sound of her door closing with a softness that meant she wanted to be alone. He'd heard all of it and known something was wrong. At 6:15 a.m., he found the termination letter on the kitchen table. At 6:45 a.m., he opened the hall closet and reached for the showbox on the top shelf, the one that had lived there for 3 years, untouched, never discussed, the one she told him never to touch. Inside were ribbons. Medals. A silver star wrapped in tissue paper. A bronze star with Valor still in its presentation case. 2 purple hearts in their original boxes. And a Navy Cross, the kind of medal that doesn't come from showing up to work, the kind that comes from doing something so extraordinary that the government marks you with metal and ceremony. Marcus sat on the living room floor at 7 a.m. with these medals spread across the carpet like artifacts from an archaeological dig, and he understood in a way that made his chest tight that his mother had been living a different life than the one he thought she was living. He understood that the woman who made his lunches and asked about his calculus homework and fell asleep on the couch watching cop shows was also a woman who had earned the respect of the United States Navy in ways that couldn't be explained over breakfast. He understood that her silence wasn't weakness, it was a weight she was carrying alone, and she was carrying it so he wouldn't have to. He understood that someone had just tried to bury her, and he was 17 years old and all he had to fight back with was the truth. Marcus moved fast. He called the school, he was sick, he wouldn't be in. He gathered the medals into a backpack along with copies of her discharge paperwork, her service record, the commendation letters from her commanding officers that she'd tucked into a file folder and never mentioned. He grabbed a printout of her original hire paperwork from Cedar Creek, the one that listed her as having completed basic nursing certification 3 years ago, the way a cover story should look. Then he put on his jacket, his backpack heavy with metal and ribbon and paper, and he walked toward Cedar Creek Medical knowing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth for someone else when they can't tell it for themselves. The hospital doors slid open at 8:33 a.m. Marcus stepped through them like he was walking into battle, because in a way, he was. His backpack was clanging, he could hear the medals shifting with every step, could hear the sound of history moving inside nylon and metal. He had the look of a teenager on a mission, the kind of look that made security personnel pause for a moment before deciding he probably belonged there. He walked past the information desk, past the elevators, toward the administrative wing where the chief of surgery had his office. He walked with his mother's composure, no hesitation, no apology, just straight ahead until someone asked him to stop. Nobody asked him to stop. He stood in the outer office at 8:53 a.m. with his backpack unzipped, the medals visible now, gleaming against the morning light coming through the windows. The receptionist looked up. The administrative assistant looked up. And Marcus said, "The only thing that mattered, I'm here to show you who my mother really is." Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.